Okay, there we go. Sorry, having a little bit of trouble there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start recording the Great Depression lecture. I'm having a little bit of insomnia at 1:30 on Sunday morning, so I'm talking a little bit more quietly because everyone in my house is asleep. So I want to talk about the Great Depression. When we wrapped up the 1920s, we had left off with the stock market crash, with the fact that you'd had overproduction, you'd had wealth disparity happening, where you had a handful of people with the majority of the wealth, and then everybody else with what was left. The stock market crash happens, and in and of itself, it does not cause the Great Depression. However, the stock market crash does fundamentally make, it shatters confidence in the banks. The banks get kind of worked up, and some of this was because you'd had unregulated investments. You also have banks that had been involved in the margins, where people borrowed money to invest in the stock market. So when those people lose the money in the stock market, the bank's not going to get any money back. So this kind of creates a problem. You're also going to see that that the stockbrokers, that a portion of the people that had the wealth are going to be affected. Now, fundamentally, it's not enough to throw the entire economy into a depression. But remember that the prosperity of the 1920s is largely illusion, that you've got farmers who are beginning to struggle, and by 1927, the farmers are having a really hard time. I think I mentioned in the 1920s lecture that there had been some attempts to pass a farm relief bill in like 1927, 1928, right as Coolidge is at the end of his term, and Coolidge vetoes it. So they knew that the farmers were struggling and that this was causing banks and farming states to go under as early as 27 and 28. And so people are starting to be concerned about this. Also remember that chart that I showed you at the very beginning of the 1920s that had those gray areas of kind of a recession period during the 1920s. Remember we had, you have the first one right after World War I. You're going to have one about 1923, 24 in relation to Germany and its financial crisis with the runaway inflation and not being able to pay back reparation payments. That will kind of be smoothed over by the Dawes Plan, which basically lets them, pay their bills with credit cards, so to speak. And that kind of covers things for a few years. And then you have some natural disasters that happen about 1927, depending on what year exactly you're talking about, which area. Mississippi River Valley floods dramatically, and those people get pulled out of the economy. The hurricanes that hit Florida on, twice in 2 years, that is going to have a huge impact on the economy, because those people, and people who had invested in real estate, just like those who had invested in the stock market, they lose their money. It makes it very hard for that segment of the population to participate. And so you've got everybody increasingly being very concerned. And remember that early in August, September 29, the really wealthy people, the ones that are professional investors, they start noticing that the cracks are getting bigger. And they start quietly moving their money out of the stock market. So by the time you have the actual crash in October 29, your big investors have already been smart enough to pull their money out, the Warren Buffetts of their day, so to speak. And so they've managed to protect their money. So the people that were left were those that aren't as savvy, that, for whatever reason were convinced they could get rich, or had, put all their savings into a stock market, and those people lose everything. And again, it's the Great Depression is a culmination of all these factors. It's not one single factor happening. Because to go from a recession to a depression, and this is a little bit of early economics here, You know, you have a recession period is where you have increasing unemployment and you have economic growth slowing down, stagnating a little bit. A depression is going backwards, where unemployment's increasing, where economic growth is negative. And so to go from a recession to a depression requires a whole lot of people being knocked out of the economy. So you just need to understand that, you know, to blame the stock market for the whole depression is not realistic, because you have so many people that were a part of this system. You know, the economy is not just one group of people. It's everybody buying, selling, contributing, working, starting businesses, investing, you name it. And so you can't just look to one single factor. Another big issue here is the consumer credit, the debt that people had. As you get to 27 and 28 and the supply and demand system, the free market, as these people, these factories who have been producing, we had very few foreign markets thanks to the tariff protections. The Hawley-Smoot tariff, right, that raised in 1930, that raises tariffs to their highest level ever, in an attempt to try to protect manufacturing and encourage you know, people to buy American products. It has the exact opposite effect. It's going to ultimately cause the economy to contract even further, because these companies that have been producing suddenly have way too much supply. They can't get rid of it, and you know, so they're trying to figure out what to do exactly. And so remember, they were kind of lying on their stock portfolios, getting people to invest money. Well, when the stock market crashes, and part of why it crashes is because people begin to realize, well, wait a minute, you know, there's some companies that aren't being completely honest with us. And so people start, you know, selling off their stocks. Well, then those companies, what are they going to do? They're not getting any money for their stocks. Matter of fact, they've lost money on their stocks. They have a warehouse full of goods that they can't sell. The first thing they're going to do is lay off workers. They have no other choice. At best, they cut wages. Well, if you cut wages and lay off workers, then that group of people, not only can they not afford to pay back the consumer credit that they've already, you know, gotten to buy their houses and their cars and their radios, but now they can't afford to buy any new stuff either. And that just makes the oversupply even worse. And so it kind of creates this vicious cycle. And it's very difficult to get the United States out of it. Remember, this is happening all over the world, too. I don't think we fully appreciate, my husband and I were talking just today, that we view the Great Depression as an American phenomenon. It wasn't just America. It was everywhere. Everybody in the 1930s, Germany, Britain, France, everybody was hurting. So even even the idea of opening up to foreign markets wouldn't have helped us that much, because everybody was hurting. There's no mistaking that this is why you have the rise of totalitarianism in the 1930s. Whether you're talking about the Nazi form or whether you're talking the much more Americanized format, which we'll see emerges with FDR and the New Deal. So now that I've waxed on for 9 minutes about really kind of the last part of the previous lecture, we're going to look at Hoover specifically and kind of look a little bit about the Americans. I think, let's see if this link will actually work here. It's hard to know for sure. You never can tell. I'm going to turn my volume down now so I don't wake up the house. Maybe, eventually, finally. This shows you some of the famous pictures that come up because of the Great Depression. Yes, that is a flour sack. Dust Bowl. Ordinary people. Black Americans were particularly affected during the Great Depression. Remember, a lot of Black Americans were sharecroppers, and so when the farming crisis hits, it hits them very hard. You know, so they really get pinched. Think about the dislocation for the children. When you have families that lose everything, those kids don't go to school. Those kids, you know, they grow up in a way that I don't think we can fully appreciate. The Great Depression has a profound impact on a generation of Americans. I would argue the Great Depression has a more profound impact on this particular generation than even World War II. I think World War II shapes us even today, but I think the Great Depression shaped this generation specifically. You can see from these images the incredible poverty some families lived in. It was such a change. America had never seen anything like this, even with the panics in the 1800s due to industrialization, even with some of the nonsense that Andrew Jackson, you know, did with the banks. It's still, you know, still not as shocking as this. So, okay. So we will go back to the Great Depression right here and see their return to full screen. Okay, so yeah, Wade has stumbled downstairs and he's interrupting me.
I was upstairs. I was in the computer.
Whatever. Okay. So we have 9,000 banks failing. 30,000 companies go out of business. Automobile profits drop by 40%. The gross national product drops almost in half. You have 12 million unemployed at around 25%. In some areas, in some cities, you had more. And keep in mind that that the way they calculated unemployment back in 1933 is very different, or really by 1932, is very different than the way we calculate unemployment now. Now, when we calculate unemployment, we don't include teenagers, people who have, you know, are filed as dependents. They're not included. So if you're, you know, 18 and you're trying to find a job and you can't, then we don't count you. If you're retired and you need to get a job to make ends meet, we don't count you if you've officially retired, or you're past retirement age. So our unemployment statistics now only reflect those people that are, you know, independent and actively looking for a job. Back then, it included anybody, right? So, you know, this should help give you a perspective that, you know, some of our unemployment rates now, sometimes, you know, during the Great Recession of 2008, we got a little bit close to this. I mean, I don't think you kids appreciate how close in 2008 we were to an actual depression. So also we see that average income fell from 2,300 to 1,600. So you're talking a pretty serious change. Remember that this is a great leveler. So we take, you know, ordinary middle-class Americans who had a degree of wealth in their homes, in their cars, in their savings account, and these people get pushed to the edge or actually into poverty. People who were already working class or in poverty get pushed even farther down. It levels a lot of people, even people who were, you know, upper middle class, who had a level of resource. If you were not one of those really savvy investors, you would turn around and find yourself much like everyone else. There's a number of primary documents in the National Archives of letters from kids who write about who write about, wanting to be able to buy a new Easter dress. I mean, for some kids, it's, I need a pair of shoes. For other kids, it's, I haven't had a new dress in a year. Which, you think, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, if you were used to having a new dress every year and suddenly your family couldn't afford that, that would be a big deal to you, even if there's people out there who are worse. Most people, and I think it's safe to say most, accept charity of some kind. Some of this could be very minor charity. Some of this could be, you're living out of your car and you're going to the bread line and soup line. So you have a lot of charity going on. Births and marriages decline significantly. Marriage desertion soars. A lot of men who can't handle watching their family struggle, watching their wife, and their children not have enough to eat, makes the men leave. A lot of these men will leave under the pretense of, I'm going to go look for a job in another city, and then the family never hears from them again. Some of this comes from the concept of American individualism and the idea that a working man does not accept charity, that the idea was it was more acceptable for a deserted wife and her children to go and accept charity than it was for a man and his family. And so you have that breaking up marriages quite a bit and changing kind of some family structures. You're going to have a challenge to gender roles, the idea that, like I said, that men can't accept charity. Also the idea about women working. Some women would go out and find work either in a domestic field or, in whatever job they could, just simply so that they could make ends meet. And for black women, this was particularly true, although, they were affected because people would lay off their help and that kind of thing. But in many communities, the black women were more likely to be employed than the black men. There's going to be a whole lot of pessimism and shame. My sociology class, we talked about this concept a few weeks ago, where people begin to realize that perhaps there's more than just themselves at work and why their life is what it is. It's not a question of, I've made bad decisions and this is why I'm in this situation. This whole concept of the Great Depression, this realization that this economic crisis has happened because there's a bunch of different forces at work, and no one person, no one group, well, except for maybe Hoover, they all blame Hoover, but beyond that, no one person had anything to do with this. And so it challenges this idea of American individualism, that you can make good choices and work really hard and you're going to be successful. Because there's lots of people that made good choices and worked really hard that were losing their homes. And so this becomes a big deal. The emergence of hobos, the men who ride on the trains looking for work, this becomes a subculture in the United States in the 1930s. Really kind of one of the first major subcultures. We'll talk in the 1960s about the countercultural movement and the hippies and that kind of stuff. And, you had kind of the transcendentalists and some of that stuff in the early 1800s. But you hadn't had a subculture emerging for quite some time. And you have it in the 1930s with the hobos. Lots of soup kitchens, private charities do what they can. Shanty towns, Hoovervilles, they called them Hoovervilles to make fun of Hoover. They're shanty towns, impromptu houses built out of cardboard, built out of, you saw some pictures earlier, cars with tents, around them. And they just kind of put them up anywhere. A lot of times they're in areas like public parks, that kind of thing. And so these people will set up, and, a lot of this happens because people lose their jobs, lose their wages, and can't afford to keep their home. So they lose their house, and so they have to pack up and move. And it does have a profound impact on American society. And I underlined this part down here. The prevailing question was how to help these people without damaging their character. The concept was a handout was a bad thing. I mean, unless you were a widow or an orphan, you shouldn't accept a handout. Because we have this whole concept of individualism in the American dream. And what do we do about that when there's so many men who are unemployed? And this is your classic picture of a soup kitchen. It's soup kitchens, bread lines. This is a line, I think it's either a bread line or it's a line for guys looking for work. I think it's a bread line, actually. You had huge lines like this, all over the country, with people trying to just piece together an existence in a lot of ways. My dad, he was a young boy during the Great Depression, remembers having shoes that had holes in them and having to use, go out and find cardboard to put in his shoes. You know, and I've always remembered, you know, the fact that my dad, to this day, keeps coffee cans of spare change in his closet. And one year we counted up all of his spare change, and he had like $500 or $600 in just like quarters and nickels and dimes. And, you know, he hadn't even realized that he had amassed that much money. And he kept it all in the bottom of his closet. And, you know, I can't help but think that his experience as a young boy with shoes that had holes in the bottom of them, and putting cardboard in them, and his family struggling to have food to eat, that doesn't have an impact on why he continues to save spare change. This one right here, you get a sense for the impact on, you know, buildings. You know, businesses close down, so now real estate's empty. That's going to be a huge issue. So yeah, it's really a big deal. You're also going to have, and I don't know that the picture has shown up yet, you do have runs on banks happening about this time. Beginning, really, if you think back to, you know, 1929, the stock market crashes, and you go from the stock market crash in the fall of 29, by spring of 1930, Hoover's saying, oh, you know, the worst effects are over, they're going to pass, it's going to be fine. Except it's not. But really, by 1930, you still don't have massive unemployment. By then, I mean, there's some economic contractions, people are a little, you know, nervous, but you don't have, you know, 25% unemployment yet. That's not going to happen until you start having more and more runs on the banks. Because what starts to happen is that, you know, somebody goes into the bank and they say, you know what, I'm a little nervous about keeping my money in the banks. I've heard there's some banks that have failed, that invested too much money in the stock market. I think I just want to pull out all my money right now. And the bank says, oh, well, you know, we don't have that much money. We don't have, you know, however many, you know, $1,000 sitting around in cash right now. We can't just give that to you. And the customer says, well, why not? You're the bank. I put my money in here. You should be able to just give me my money. And the banks, you know, they can't do that. And so the word gets out that they can't give somebody their money right away. And so then there's a big panic, and you get a bunch more people coming in. If you've ever watched It's a Wonderful Life, the kind of the bank panic that happens to the Bailey building alone is kind of what I'm talking about here, where you have a bunch of people going, I want my money right now. And the banks end up not being able to cover all of that, so they have to shut their doors. And keep in mind that back then, there's not a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That's a New Deal thing that happens after FDR takes over in 1933. So you have banks that can't guarantee deposits. So when a bank shuts its door, you lose your money. So now, on top of all the other factors having to do with the Great Depression, now we've got these banks that are having trouble staying open because people are getting nervous and they want to pull their money out because they don't trust the banks. And the banks, of course, then don't have enough money on hand because they've made bad loans, because they've loaned money to stockbrokers, or they've paid out loaned too much money for building and construction booms. And as you can see in this picture, right, offices get shuttered, and next thing you know, the building's not collecting any rent, and that owner can't make their payments. And so it just kind of creates this huge crisis. So you have that happening in 30, 31, and by the time you get to 1932, this is when you see the 25% unemployment. This is when you see banks closing. But it's a snowball effect that begins in 1930 and takes about 2 years to really reach its peak. And in fact, it won't really peak until like winter of 33 is when it's really kind of the worst. And we'll talk when we get to FDR. A big part of that has to do with the fact that FDR is not inaugurated till March of 33. It's after 1933 that we change the inauguration date to January, so that there's not such a long lame duck period between the election and the new president taking over. And so you really kind of, that because of the lame duck period, 1933 is a really rough year. And so this is just to kind of give you a context for it. We also see a crisis on the Great Plains. Remember that World War I and technological advances had encouraged overproduction. This overproduction, of course, doesn't just happen in the period of World War I. It happened before that, during the Gilded Age, where increasing technological advances made them overproduce, and they totally ruined the topsoil. You have a drought that begins to hit in the late 20s. The drought makes everything this worse, and you end up having lots of wind. Of course, the Great Plains was always windy. They cause these dust storms that removes more of the topsoil. You get up to like 50 dust storms between 1932 and 39. A couple of these are pretty significant. There's at least one that is so bad that eventually the dust gets to New York City. And I mean, literally, it was like it was dark. You have many farmers who had borrowed money to expand, and they can't keep up in the 1920s. And so now the banks are foreclosing and the farmers are homeless. Many of these farmers will pack up and head to the cities, whether you're talking, farmers heading into the city of Dallas or heading into the city of Atlanta or whatever. But you also have a lot of them that pack up and move to California, thinking that, well, California has an agricultural sector. I know how to farm. Maybe I can find work there. California has a better climate. So they start looking for this better life, and they create these campsites all along the way to California. And once they get to California, they put a huge strain on the state of California, because now California has all these shanty towns popping up everywhere. And it becomes a real crisis for California. I think I've mentioned before Upton Sinclair's End Poverty in California campaign, where he talked about collectivization and all that kind of stuff. And so this is kind of where that crisis comes from. The hardest hit states were Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, South and North Dakota. Okies are the name given to these migrating farmers, although many of them weren't from Oklahoma, but just kind of becomes the name. If you've been reading The Grapes of Wrath, that's what this story's about. And all of this crisis on the Dust Bowl adds to the number of unemployed, homeless, and hungry. Let's see if my link works again. This picture right here is a famous picture from Dorothea Lange. She took a picture of this mom who had sold the tires on her car to buy milk for the babies. What is she going to do now? Dorothea Lange is a very famous photojournalist from the Great Depression, documented the migrant farm workers specifically. One of the things that will happen during the Great Depression, and as part of the New Deal, is that the federal government will begin to fund writers, photographers, to document the circumstances of the Great Depression. This is part of why we know as much about it as we do. In addition to having the technology to record it, we actually put money behind recording it. Again, remember the impact of this depression on the kids. Many of them would leave school to have to go find some kind of work to help their family buy food. So it's pretty shocking. I'll go ahead and close this because we don't need to see that. All right. Back to the Great Depression, return to full screen. Okay. So all of this adds to the number of unemployed, homeless, and hungry. This shows you one of the major dust storms. People thought it was the end of the world when this stuff happened. I mean, seriously. That's monstrous looking. This kind of shows you one picture. Really, the dust that it affected, that map needs to be a little bit more over here, I think. But that kind of tells you. This shows you some of the soil erosion. Again, they'd overfarmed, destroyed the topsoil, and it just goes through that whole area. That's where the dust comes from. Picks it up from one place and deposits it like this in another. Yeah, that's a lot of dirt. There are stories of cows that they find dead, and they realize that their lungs are full of dirt. People would get dust pneumonia from so much dust in the air, and this pushed these migrant farm workers. Notice this one. Next time, try the train relax as these hobos are walking down the street. More of these pictures showing how people lived, the campsites and that kind of thing. The Depression hits Mexicans and Mexican Americans and African Americans the hardest. Remember, they had already been on the margins of society as far as, particularly politically, but also we see economically. The Mexican Americans that had moved up to take work that the Great Migration had left blacks, or left openings because the blacks had moved up north. They're not wanted anymore because first off, there's not that much farm work, and then because of the Dust Bowl and that kind of thing, and because of the low farm prices. But then you also are going to have people being very concerned about the job competition, and so they're going to start deporting Mexicans and their American-born children back to Mexico. Cesar Chavez and LULAC, while they don't actually come, per se from the 1930s. Cesar Chavez, I believe, is born in the late 30s or early 40s. LULAC shortly thereafter, after World War II. But a lot of this has to do with kind of this shaping experience of the Great Depression for them. Black Americans continue to fight racial violence. The migration up north, slows down because of shrinking incomes, and you begin to see Black Americans really kind of focusing on survival and that kind of thing. And trying to find a way to function in this 1930s world. We do have a lot more, lynchings happening in the 1930s because there's economic stress. And it's proven economic stress tends to cause racial violence. The impact on American culture, you're going to have Hollywood The one thing that people would try to manage to do, especially the people, if you're setting aside the, say the Okies and the people that have completely lost everything, the people that are holding on to middle class, that still have jobs, they're economically struggling. They've lost their savings. They're being very careful with their dollars. So they don't have a lot of money, but you do see that the money they have, they'll once a week, once a month, they'll go to the movies. And so you'll start to see really kind of this golden age of Hollywood during the 1930s. Radio, remember, so many people had purchased radios in the 1920s. So this is a big kind of escapism, entertainment. You have many Americans that want to escape their problems, and the popular culture takes care of that. And that's why the movies and the radio focus on not so much the reality of what people are living. It's very much escapism. The literature and photography, those tend to document the reality, even if popular culture tends to focus on escapism. This is a famous painting by Grant Wood called American Gothic. It comes from this Great Depression period, kind of shows the hardiness of the American people, of the American farmer, kind of the stoicism of the classic American farmer. Lots of interesting artistic elements right here with the pitchfork and the same design in his overalls. Her dress pattern is repeated up here in the window. So if you're kind of an art person, there's some interesting details with that. So Hoover comes in. Remember, he won the election in 28, took over in March of 29. So when the stock market crash happens, none of it has anything to do with him. Hoover had been a big part of the Harding-Coolidge administrations. He participated in Wilson's administration. So he's very much a bipartisan kind of guy. He was technically a Republican, but he worked with pretty much anybody. He was a kind of an administrative kind of person. Think Taft-like, probably a better administrator than a politician. And he'd been a part of the Food Administration. He helped control, food and make sure there was enough food not only for Americans but for Europeans in World War I. Served, as Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge. He did not mind government action, but his idea of government action was only to kind of guide and kind of recommend. He was a big fan of supply-side economics, so he did not like taxes. He was very concerned about the American individual and concerned what would happen if you start giving too many handouts to people. And so his only response is, well, we just need to cut taxes. We need to encourage businesses to not lay people off. We need to encourage people to keep spending and not hoard their money. That's how he saw government in kind of this advisory role. Notice March 1930, the worst effects of the crash will have passed during the next 60 days. He wants calm reasoning, cooperation. And he does ultimately try to do some actually more aggressive things to fix the economy, but it's too little and too late. Hoover kind of gets a bad rap, I think. This cartoon here, here's Herbert Hoover with the HH on his apron. Awful job to quiet anything around here. Drought damage, tariff, business depression, all these crying babies, and he can't get them to be quiet. And who's outside the window but the Democrats, right? The donkey. The Democratic National Committee on his hat. All the old familiar songs here. Nobody knows how dry I am, referring to the drought. The good times they used to be. Tain't gonna rain no mo. And so this is a classic cartoon that's actually somewhat sympathetic to Hoover, in that, he's doing the best that he can. And I think that that's a fair assessment. He was trying to do the right things. He took very seriously this question of American individualism, and that if you give people handouts, you somehow destroy their work ethic. I think there's something to that. One of the issues that we've had with LBJ's Great Society and the welfare programs, is that they were initially put in place without much attention to what could happen to the work ethic. You know, human beings are human beings, and if they can get something for free, they will. And so I think that he was not incorrect to have concerns about that. However, his response to trying to stimulate the economy was just so cautious and so slow. Now, one of the things we'll see with FDR's New Deal is, and FDR, I mean Franklin Roosevelt, FDR is very aggressive. Let's try anything. If it doesn't work, we'll go back to the drawing board. Well, that's great, and he does make some headway against the Depression. But there's also unintended consequences to some of those actions. And, we'll talk about some of those unintended consequences. And I think it's fair to kind of recognize that it's never as simple as one action. Sorry for the young one. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning. So it's just something that, we should be understanding that Hoover was trying to fix things. He was just very cautious, and while that wasn't what was called for in 1931, 32, he did do the best that he could. And you do see by the end of his presidency, he begins to kind of change the way he approaches things. You see him starting to be a little more willing to have more aggressive government action. He opposes direct relief, which is money paid directly to individuals and families. He's uncomfortable with the public works program because he feels that, like I said, we're going to damage the, American character. It's the opposite of individualism, that public works programs and handouts, welfare checks or unemployment insurance, that's communism, right? Isn't that what we fought against World War I for, And so he's very anti-communistic in that sense, and so he's concerned about what will happen if we start doing these things. He also sees relief as a state and a local issue, that when people pay their tax dollars, if the people in Sunnyvale choose to take their tax dollars and want to give a portion of it towards a charity group so that they can distribute, meals to people in need, then that community can decide to do so, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a whole different story if you're talking about the federal government that's taking tax dollars from everybody, taking tax dollars from everybody in the country and then distributing them according to the different states. Why should somebody who pays their taxes in Virginia have their tax dollars go to help somebody in Texas? That just doesn't make any sense. That tax dollars that go to relief programs need to come at the state level. And even more specifically at the local level. And so you see that, that's his whole approach. And so by 1932, after a couple of years of this increasing unemployment, this increasing problem, remember this is a snowballing effect, right? The cities and states are out of money, and they don't have money for anything, right? I mean, we're not talking about they just don't have money for charity organizations. They don't have money for schools. They don't have money for roads, you name it. And so you have some real major kind of economic crises happening at the city and state level. The one big exception to this is going to be the state of New York. Governor Roosevelt was in charge of New York in 1931. He won the governorship, in 1930. And so he starts a thing called the Temporary Emergency Relief Agency, TERA. And it becomes highly successful in New York. And in fact, New York State is probably the exception to most other states, in that they have a very active kind of government services program. And so one of the things that will help FDR win in 1932 is his record in New York, and the fact that New Yorkers were faring better during the Great Depression thanks to the relief agencies. 1932, Congress will pass the Emergency Relief and Construction Act. And Hoover does reluctantly sign it. He doesn't veto it, and he very well could have. And I think this tells us a lot about his feeling about government, that if Congress passed it, he wasn't going to stand in the way, even though he didn't necessarily agree with it. So he does sign this bill that he doesn't like, and it gives $300 million of federal money to the states, for the states to distribute for direct relief programs. But that's still not enough. by the time you get to 1932, the problem is way bigger than that. Had they done this in 1930 or 1931, who knows? Maybe that would have changed things. So you have him encouraging some conferences. Remember, he's a big cooperation, let the government just advise you kind of thing. And so he does this between big business, railroads, banks, labor. And most industries try to promise to stop dropping wages and laying off people in 1930, but by 1931, the situation's just too bad. I mean, you can't, at some point, if you're going to be a business, you have to, keep the lights on. And if you're paying people wages and you can't keep the power on, then that kind of defeats the purpose. So this is one of the reasons why we see that the overall effect of the stock market crash and then the bank panics is beginning to have a snowball effect, is that you can kind of see that that there were some things Hoover was trying to do, to address these problems and to kind of make things better. And then you have increased public works projects. He does authorize the Hoover Dam. This is going to put the gigantic dam along the Colorado River between Arizona and Nevada. And this is meant to create electric power, primarily for Southern California, but also for all of the Southwest. Now the issue is the Hoover Dam in and of itself, even though it starts during Hoover's administration, is not a big enough project on its own. It's a massive project, don't get me wrong, it's a big deal. But by itself, it's not going to put 25% of Americans back to work. And Hoover was still very concerned about, okay, he could justify the Hoover Dam because it's going to improve things for a number of different states. So he kind of justifies that. But his big problem with public works programs is going to be this issue of that the government shouldn't borrow money. And so the government has to be able to pay for a public works program. Well, if they can't pay for it, then they can't have it. And remember, this comes from Mellon and supply side economics, that deficit spending is bad. So the Hoover Dam does put people back to work, but not enough people to make things completely better. And you're also going to see that, because Hoovers won't go into debt at the federal level, that, we just don't get enough going. Federal Reserve is a part of this problem, too. They keep interest rates high. They panic in 1929, 1930, and they think, oh my gosh, people have been speculating too much. We need to raise rates. Now, keep in mind that they hadn't raised rates at all in the 1920s. So as we're going into 26, 27, 28, let's keep interest rates low because we want to keep the economy booming. That was the time to raise interest rates to slow down some of the speculation. But they don't bother to do that until after the stock market's already crashed. And so by raising interest rates, they effectively slow the economy down even more. So now businesses that could have kept their doors open by getting a favorable loan to kind of keep the lights on and pay the wages, they can't do that. So now they have no choice but to lay people off. The National Credit Corporation, Hoover's first idea was a voluntary pool of money. Every single bank was kind of like an insurance plan. Every single bank gives a little bit of money to this, and this NCC will then distribute money to banks in trouble. They try to get it off the ground, but it still isn't enough money to help the banks. So in 1932, you see that they create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, where they actually take federal dollars that have been collected through taxation, and they're going to lend that money out to banks, to railroads, to agribusiness, that kind of thing, to try to keep the economy going. And we see this today. Our government all the time loans money. Most recently, we had the bailout programs. And so the bailout that happened in 2008, 2009, that was not the first time that it happened. We saw this happen in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. The problem is the RFC in 1932 was extremely cautious. And it was led by very conservative leaders who were like, oh, well, we're not so sure about this. We think this is too much. We believe in the hand of the economy and all that kind of stuff. And then they end up helping banks more than they help actual businesses. Well, the problem with the bank, if you help a bank stay open, that's great, I suppose, for the individuals who have their savings account there. But the bank has to loan money out for it to have a big kind of ripple effect. And remember the Federal Reserve. It's not making it easy to loan money. So they help banks a lot more than they help actual businesses, and it doesn't have as big of an effect. So that's kind of an issue. America, of course, they make fun of the shanty towns and call them Hoovervilles. We will see that there's hunger marches and violence. The Communist Party becomes a big deal in the 1930s, which will be interesting when we get to McCarthyism after World War II. There's a lot of people that attend Communist Party meetings in the 1930s. I mean, people are upset about the Depression, and they're willing to talk about other kind of political answers. And so this is kind of one of the ironies of McCarthy hunting down communists. There were a lot of people that kind of at least went to a meeting or knew somebody or took a pamphlet or something like that. So the Communist Party becomes a big deal. You have this kind of a march to Washington, D.C. Fascism, as it's emerging in Germany and in Italy, begins to make communism seem more favorable. And, I'll explain later on kind of the big difference between communism and fascism. But that's going to encourage the increase in communism. There's going to be a big strike at the Ford plant. You're going to end up having violence happening there. Farmers are going to resist the foreclosures. They're basically going to shut down the foreclosure sales. They're also going to destroy crops and products in order to try to reduce supply. Except, of course, they can never reduce enough. I mean, the prices are so low and the market is so bad that it doesn't matter how much they destroy. The worst part is they're destroying the stuff while people are going hungry in the cities. One of the most unfortunate events of Hoover's administration is going to be the Bonus Army. So the Bonus Army comes from the fact that World War I veterans had been promised a bonus in 1924. And of course, as always, unemployment hits the vets a lot worse than it does anybody else. And so it gets proposed by a Texas congressman that they pay the bill a little bit early, right? This will help the veterans out. And, there's some debate in the House of Representatives and in the Senate as to whether or not this is going to pass. It actually does pass the House. But the question is whether the Senate's going to pass it. And, of course, remember the Senate tends to be more conservative than the House of Representatives. So you have a bunch of unemployed veterans and their families march to Washington, D.C. They end up setting up a shanty town there. And they're asking Hoover to meet with them to show his support for this bill, to kind of encourage the Senate to maybe vote for a yes. And Hoover refuses to meet with them. And then, of course, the Senate will then turn around and not pass the bill. And they start marching. It's nothing violent, but they are marching. They are, basically, taking over, kind of think the 99% protest that they have where they kind of like set up in Central Park. It's kind of the same idea. They're set up in public facilities. So it kind of looks bad, right? It looks bad. There's some hygiene issues, some, all this kind of stuff. And so Hoover's like, and think, the women's suffrage movement, right? The Silent Sentinel standing outside of Wilson's White House. It looks bad for that kind of stuff to be going on in Washington, D.C. And so Hoover says, what, I want these buildings cleared out. This isn't healthy. This isn't safe. This looks bad. And so he orders a guy by the name of Douglas MacArthur, who, yes, you'll recognize from World War II. Not a MacArthur fan, just in case you want to know. I'll explain more when we get to World War II. But talk to anybody that knows anything about World War II who's like really studied it significantly. They'll tell you MacArthur, not nearly as great as he thought he was. Anyway, so MacArthur and the Army with the Washington, D.C. police, they basically march in and they clear the camps. And you have violence and tear gas and that kind of thing. Really kind of solidifies Hoover's bad impression, right? So here he's had this very conservative response to to the Great Depression, very cautious, very careful, which isn't necessarily awful in and of itself. But there's this perception that he doesn't care, that he's not doing enough, that he's not listening to what the public is demanding, and obviously with this bonus army march, now he's taking it out on veterans, and it just looks bad. This is a very telling picture of the Capitol building in the background as they burn down shanty towns. So Hoover's legacy. Hoover fails to solve the problem of the Great Depression, but his Reconstruction Finance Corporation is the first of its kind, which is the direct government involvement in the economy during peacetime. As I said before, we still use that, that kind of concept today. This is a part of how our government functions now. And so Hoover's legacy, while he didn't solve the Great Depression, it wasn't, he did try to do some things. So it's easy, I think history looks back at Hoover more with kind of an unfortunate shake of the head. He did try to do some things were good. He was very cautious, and certainly when you compare some of the unintended consequences of the New Deal, you can see where Hoover's cautiousness might have been a good thing, that maybe FDR could have used a little bit of a cautious voice going on. But Hoover, he's the guy left holding the bag, and so it looks pretty bad for him. All right, then we're going to have, I think, did I skip a page? I did, didn't I? Okay. So the election in 1932, Republicans endorse Hoover again because they like his cautious, careful approach. The Democrats choose Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Remember, New York State had been, been a great example of how to respond with government action. And FDR makes the broadest, should have a T on it, appeal, where he basically he promises everything, like all politicians do. Oh, I'll balance the budget, and we'll have public works. Oh, I'm going to help business, and the forgotten man. And he's going to try a little bit to do all of this. Of course, this is kind of a big promise. And, Hoover basically denounces FDR's program, but his program from New York State, and kind of this idea of public works and helping the forgotten man, that it's going to destroy the Americans' way of life and all this kind of stuff, and a lot of that drama. And Hoover was very kind of resentful later on of his legacy, that he kind of got stuck holding that bag. And I don't know that I blame him necessarily. As I said, when we talk about the New Deal, you'll see that there's some really unfortunate consequences to the New Deal that I think FDR, never really owned up to. We see that FDR wins very easily with 58% of the popular vote. He shows a new coalition of Democratic voters from the North, the South, and the West, which was something, if you remember back to William Jennings Bryan, the Democrats have been trying desperately to do for some time. And so remember, the South is struggling with farms, the West is struggling with farms, the North, the immigrants, the workers. And we're going to see that most Americans begin to feel that a modern industrial state needs more than just a reliance on business and capitalism, that you have to have more than that. You've got to have kind of a balance in the system, that capitalism left to its own devices can have some pretty unfortunate consequences, and I don't think that's wrong. This is a picture of FDR in 1920 before he gets stricken with polio. Of course, one of the big characteristics of FDR is that he was in a wheelchair. He got polio in the 1920s when he was in his 30s. I think was it 24 when he got polio, or maybe it was 22, something like that. Shortly after he ran as a vice presidential candidate. So he gets, he's basically wheelchair bound. He does walk some with braces, so when you see video clips of him standing at a podium, he is standing on his own. But you need to understand how incredibly painful it was for him to stand. He had these braces that kind of locked his knees. And that's why there's very few pictures of him Most pictures are of him in a car. That's how typically he made appearances. But he was in a wheelchair. He was a disabled president, and certainly there is an argument to be made that his struggle with polio is part of what makes him so unique and able to handle the issues of the Great Depression. And he is a unique leader. Not a perfect leader. There is no such thing. But he is very unique. So I will stop this here, and I'll be recording the lecture on the New Deal. And going from that, hey, it's only 60 minutes long. All right.